76-year-old French novelist Renaud Camus, no relation to Albert Camus, tells us of the day he had his red pill moment. Now, the red pill moment, if you're unfamiliar, is a reference to the 1999 science fiction movie, The Matrix. In The Matrix, the hero is, spoiler alert, trapped inside a fictional reality constructed by a hostile ruling elite designed to control his mind. The ruling elite in question is killer robots. And the hero is offered a red pill that if he takes it, it will shatter the illusion, allow him to finally see reality. But he's warned that once you see the truth, you can never go back to the illusion. In alt-right circles on the internet and in various men's rights groups, the red pill moment is the moment in a young white man's life when the scales fall from his eyes and he suddenly understands that all of the features of the modern world have been crafted by nefarious actors to emasculate and destroy him. Those nefarious actors are primarily feminists, women in general, multiculturalists, liberalists, globalists, and a cabal of unspecified elites. When someone uses the language of taking the red pill or their red pill moment, they're usually describing their awakening into white nationalist consciousness. Sometimes it means there's something called an incel, and if that's the case, run far away as fast as you can. For Renaud, French author Renaud, his red pill moment came when he moved out of Paris in the early 1990s and he bought a castle in the French countryside, like you do. He was visiting a 1,000-year-old village in the south of France when he came to a fountain in the center of town. And there in this very traditional French locale, I assume it was like neoclassical architecture fountain, right? He encountered something he was not expecting. He encountered a group of veiled women who were just hanging out around the fountain, having their day. And then he looked up around him, and in the window panes, the very traditional French windows in the traditional French buildings, he saw more veiled women looking back at him through those windows. And that was it. That was his epiphany. That was his moment of clarity, because France did not look like France to him anymore. Whatever his vision of France was, it did not include a village square significantly populated with brown-skinned, veiled, non-Christian women. This was something else. And the cause of that something else, he realized that transformation was a flood of people from outside coming in. He would come to call that flood the Great Replacement. Now, before his red pill moment, Renaud was a socialist who was most famous for his gay rights activism in the 1970s. His best-known work, and the only one translated into English, is a 1979 memoir called Tricks, about his sexual exploits while traveling around the world. So he is an unlikely figure to be fueling American right-wing and white nationalist movements. And Renaud insists he is not a racist. And despite his support for French right-wing politician Marine Le Pen, he says he is not associated with right-wing movements. He paints himself simply as an ordinary fellow who, in his words, wants France to stay French. And after his awakening in the village, Renaud became obsessed with the idea that unchecked immigration, primarily by Muslims, would mean the end of the French people. Now, the New York Times notes that the population of France was about 5% composed of immigrants when Renaud was born in 1947, and it is 10% composed of immigrants today. And that is a substantial change, no doubt, but it is not the sweeping takeover of the French population that Renaud fears. And nonetheless, in 2002, he formed a political party which the Times reports called for an end to all immigration and promoted sending immigrants and their children back to their country of origin. Then in 2011, he wrote a book in French called Le Grand Remplacement. Forgive my pronunciation. In English, it is The Great Replacement. So Williams, author of the New Yorker article, summarizes the thesis of this book. Native white Europeans, Renaud argues, are being reverse colonized by black and brown immigrants who are flooding the continent in what amounts to an extinction-level event. The Great Replacement is very simple, he has said. You have one people, and in the space of a generation, you have a different people. And Camus believes that all Western countries, including the United States, are faced with varying degrees of ethnic and civilizational substitution. His words. Now, Renaud's ideas were amplified by another group of far-right French cultural critics who called for the preservation of their own cultural identity against foreign encroachment. Foreign encroachment, whether that meant by immigrants or by global corporate homogenization. You may have heard of like the Big Macification of Europe or the Disneyfication of the world, right? This right-wing movement was called identitarianism, as in the preservation of my identity, identitarianism. And while Renaud denies a connection to the American right, the identitarians very explicitly came to America to share their ideas with far right-wing foundations and with American white nationalist publications about this existential threat to Western culture. And in America, they proved to be deeply influential to American white nationalists like Richard Spencer and others. And so the language of the Great Replacement and its apocalyptic vision of the end of the West spread like wildfire across the internet via chat rooms and YouTube videos. And critics say that Renaud and these other identitarian authors, they act as intellectual cover for traditional white nationalist groups. They provide what Williams calls a respectable veneer of sophistication and high-minded objectivity to nativist and nationalist impulses that extend back into the 20th century and are rooted in very familiar prejudices. And in America, that means racism, right? So Renaud's Great Replacement theory was immediately and explicitly racialized as soon as it arrived in America. Renaud may argue, and does argue, that he merely wants to preserve the unique particularities of his French culture as he remembers it. He claims no innate superiority for that culture. But for the American white nationalist movement, the Great Replacement is all about preserving the superiority of the white race in the face of non-white immigrants. The Anti-Defamation League notes that because American white nationalists blame Jewish people for immigration, and don't ask me what exactly the connection is there, the Great Replacement theory also became anti-Semitic when it landed on American shores. But wait, there's more. The Great Replacement is largely an anxiety about numbers. It is driven by a fear of losing one's majority status in one's own country. And declining white or Western birth rates is thus a key component of the story of the Great Replacement. The fear is that declining birth rates in the white West will eventually lead to white people being replaced by non-white people, by being outbred. And declining birth rates in the West are blamed on, as you have no doubt already surmised, feminists. So in a 2019 New York Times story called "A Racist, Sexist Doctrine Spreads in Far-Right Circles" by Nellie, the story quotes Kathleen Belew, who is a history professor at the University of Chicago and an expert on these groups. She says, for people in the white power movement, everything is framed through reproduction and gender. And so the white power movement is very concerned that women are working instead of staying at home and having more children. And this is blamed on feminism. Belew says, what's gaining more of a foothold in these circles is the idea of reversing a women's right to vote. She says, that was something I used to see in overtly neo-Nazi spaces, but now I'm seeing it introduced in less extremist spaces. That's going to be a theme. First introduced as a joke, of course, and then as an acceptable policy that maybe not all users agree with, but still it's worth discussing. Right? Reversing a women's right to vote. LGBTQ people are then pulled into this mess based on the idea that gender diversity is confusing male gender roles and demasculating men, leading to more girl power, leading to fewer white babies. So in short, within a span of about 10 years, the Great Replacement theory seems to be functioning in white power circles as like a grand unified theory of hate. It brings together anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny in a toxic stew dedicated to the preservation of whiteness. And a recent NPR story notes that the speed with which this theory has propagated from the dark recesses of the internet to more mainstream websites and then into mainstream political channels has stunned experts who track political extremism. And the propagation has come with deadly consequences. Right? In 2017, on the eve of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, young white men infamously paraded with torches through the University of Virginia campus chanting, "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us." All right? A direct reference to the Great Replacement ideology. And the next day, a woman was killed, and many more were injured in violence that broke out at the rally. And this ideology has then motivated a spate of deadly shootings since 2017. Summarized on the Anti-Defamation League website, in October of 2018, a white supremacist killed 11 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh after writing an online post blaming Jews for bringing non-white immigrants to the US. In March 2019, a white supremacist killed 51 people at 2 mosques in New Zealand after putting a manifesto online called The Great Replacement. In April 2019, a white supremacist killed 1 and injured 3 at a synagogue in California. In a letter, he blamed Jewish people for seeking the destruction of the white race. In August 2019, a white supremacist opened fire at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, killing 23 people and wounding almost 24. In a manifesto, he talked about a Hispanic invasion and made reference to the Great Replacement. And then, just a week ago, a white supremacist shot and killed 10 people at a supermarket in Buffalo, deliberately targeting black people. He repeatedly cited the Great Replacement in his writings. In spite of its association with explicitly racist neo-Nazi organizations and its connection to murderous violence, since 2017, the Great Replacement theory has increasingly moved from the extreme margins of American political discourse into the mainstream. One of its greatest popularizers is American talk show host Tucker Carlson, who draws in an audience of 3 to 4 million people every night, overwhelmingly white, mostly older. Carlson has retained the language of the Great Replacement, using those words explicitly, but he has sanitized the idea somewhat by recasting it in terms of electoral politics. The idea that he expresses over and over on his show is that an amorphous group of political and cultural liberal elites and Democrats want to replace the population of what he calls legacy Americans with millions of immigrants from the, quote, third world, who Carlson claims will be more obedient to the liberal agenda. So 2 things are worthy of note here. 1, according to the Times, the term legacy Americans that Carlson is popularizing was only ever found in white nationalist publications like Stormfront until Carlson brought it into the mainstream. That's where it comes from. 2, as the Anti-Defamation League notes, Carlson's talk of invading immigrants is not just a racist dog whistle, it is a bullhorn. And one of the things Carlson likes to say to his overwhelmingly white audience is some variation of, it's okay for you to say, what is this? He tells them. It's okay for you to say, maybe I don't want to live in a country that looks nothing like the country that I grew up in. And a Times analysis of 1,150 episodes of Carlson's show found references to the Great Replacement in 400 different episodes. And from there, the idea has been affirmed and amplified publicly by mainstream politicians, elected officials like Representative Matt Gaetz in Florida. And a recent poll reported by NPR found that 1 in 3 Americans now believe some version of the idea that there is a deliberately orchestrated plot to replace the American population with immigrants in order to secure electoral gains. 1 in 3 Americans. So what do we do with this? How do we respond, and how might we respond as Unitarian Universalists? Well, it's interesting for me to note that I have played or read or otherwise shared the Guante poem that you just heard, How to Explain White Supremacy to a White Supremacist, several times since 2017. 2017 was when the language and the concepts of white supremacy and white supremacy culture became something that Unitarian Universalists were asked to reflect on and wrestle with through the work of groups like Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, other anti-racist leaders, multiple resolutions at General Assembly, right? We were asked to be more anti-racist as congregations, and we were asked to grapple with this idea of white supremacy culture. And so I shared this poem and the distinction between the shark and the ocean that Guante uses to say, hey, we're not talking about skinheads here. We're talking about institutional racism and the way it shapes our lives and our culture. And that's still so true. And yet the shark seems to be circling closer and closer in the waters these days. Guante says, I don't really know any white supremacists. And that's probably still true for most of us, and yet the line between what is and what is not acceptable in American politics is getting dangerously blurred, and explicitly white supremacist groups are being strengthened and encouraged because they see their words being amplified in the mainstream. And this needs our attention, right? We need to push back hard and vocally when our elected leaders, when public officials, when people in the media parrot the talking points of explicit white supremacy. We need to say no, absolutely no, and we need to support and amplify the countervailing voices. We need to demand accountability, and we need to organize and mobilize. But it is also important not to give in to the head fake that Guante is warning us about in his poem, not to focus too much on figures like Stephen Miller or someone like Tucker Carlson or the boogeyman of the KKK, which can give us an easy out from doing the broader work of undoing racism that we have to do. Because it is still true that it is the ocean and not the shark, really. It's the inertia of history that functions continuously in the background when we do nothing, right? It's disinvestment and underinvestment. It's redlining. It's toxic dumps and coal plants in minority neighborhoods. It's discrimination. It's housing discrimination. It's mass incarceration. This is where the historic harm of white supremacy manifests, has manifested, will manifest, until we work together to create something different. That is still our work to do. But we have to do both things in this moment, because we needed another thing, right? In this moment, we need to be vigilant and diligent about resisting and calling out these manifestations of fringe movements and fringe ideologies like white supremacy and fascism and anti-Semitism that are coming into our mainstream culture and our mainstream politics. And that is part of who we are, and that is part of what we do too. Our flaming chalice itself is a symbol of resistance to fascism and Nazism and anti-Semitism. That is where it came from. And if you don't know that story, ask me about it sometime. But as UUs, we also need to continuously lift up our second principle of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and keep lifting up that vision of a just society, and keep working toward that vision of a society in which all people are held in care, all people are supported and nurtured, all people have the resources they need to live healthy lives, all people have the resources they need to flourish. That's what we're talking about, because we need a positive vision to combat the ideologies of scarcity and fear. We need a positive vision of generosity and interdependence and mutual care to invite people into. And finally, I want to thank Onestine for his amazing song today and the message that he brought to the service. Because in the face of violence and in the face of the politics of fear, it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to get weary. It's easy to be overwhelmed. And so I invite us also to remember that there's powerful love at work in the world, always, every day. There is powerful love at work in the world, always, every day. And we have been gifted with a world of abundant beauty that calls us to a deeper joy even amidst the world's concerns, always, every day. And when we commit in our congregations and in our individual lives to building the world we dream of, to building the beloved community, we can be clear-minded and real about the challenges we face, and we can also be a little naive. We can be naive enough to believe in a love that won't let us go. A love that can yet open people's hearts, a love that can transform the world. We UUs have been called the love people. May it be love that guides us ultimately, and love that keeps alight the fire of our commitment. Blessed be, and amen.